We refuse to let deaths, snatched by evil and snared by depravity, to ever be in vain. And so it is with the victims of the Holocaust, the crematoriums, the scorched sacred Torah scrolls, the houses of worship burnt to what was once sacred ground, the over 1 million children, and without an allied attack on the final solution, almost the entire Jewish population. The only remains of the final solution, that unadulterated hatred that pure evil did not incinerate, are the remnant living souls forever known as the survivors. Every breath they have taken is not for themselves, but instead consecrated to preserve the collective breath that remains of the Jewish people. Each inhale is proof that every man, woman, and child is not forgotten. Every exhale is a silent memorial prayer heard in heaven. As Pete Seeger and a dear brother, Peter Yarrow, who is online with us today, has taught us, when will they ever learn? When will they ever learn? Well, when will we ever learn? The biblical supplication intended for every generation. You shall not stand idly by the blood of your brother, not then, not now, not ever. A finite group of survivors chose to devote a portion of the remainder of their breaths to educating, especially the impressionable children, that love, kindness, and compassion must triumph over all forms of hatred. Marion Blumenthal Lazan is one of the last surviving antidotes to the most virulent virus known to humankind. It says in the Psalms that God has made us a little lower than the angels, but Marion is that rare higher exception. Listen intently. Every time I have ever heard Marion speak, I sense that God was standing right next to her in awe of what he had created. Marion?
Thank you, dear Manny, for your meaningful, kind, and generous introduction. I thank you for giving me the opportunity to virtually participate in this, your very important, meaningful program. Today, I am here to share my story. It is my childhood experiences during World War II in the concentration camps. I will tell you about our liberation and how we finally started our lives anew right here in the United States. Mine is a story that conveys a message of perseverance, determination, faith, and above all, hope. Life in the early 1930s in Germany was very much for my family, as it is here for most of you today. Never did we think that the anti-Semitic incidents there would ever lead to very much. My father was in a successful shoe business in a small town. My parents, 2-year older brother, and I lived comfortably with my grandparents above the shoe store. Life for Jews was made increasingly more difficult. And in 1935, the Nuremberg laws were formulated and enforced. The following are just some of the many restrictions imposed on the Jews in Germany. Jews were not allowed into theaters, into parks, or into swimming pools. All public schools were closed to Jewish children. Then there was an evening curfew for the Jews. Jews were only allowed to shop during specific hours of the day, and non-Jews were not allowed to shop in Jewish-owned stores. Non-Jews were just not allowed to associate with Jewish people. And then a big letter J for Jew was stamped on ID cards and on passports. These restrictions went on and on. And it was then that my parents decided to make arrangements to leave the country. My grandparents, who were in the late 70s and ill, refused to leave their home. They could not understand the urgency or the necessity of doing so. My grandparents passed away in 1938, just 11 days within each other. And soon thereafter, we received our necessary papers for our immigration to America. I was just 4 years old at that time. November 9th, 1938, Kristallnacht, or Crystal Night. It was the night of broken glass when the Nazis and their many followers smashed the windows and the storefronts of Jewish-owned stores. Jewish establishments, synagogues, and Jewish books were burned and destroyed. This was the beginning of a massive pogrom against the Jews in Germany, a massive verbal and physical assault against all German Jews. In reality, this was the beginning of the Holocaust. On November 12th, following Kristallnacht, the German government actually fined the Jewish population for the damage caused that night. These imposed taxes were used to rearm Germany. The night of Kristallnacht, our apartment was ransacked. All valuables were thrown into a pillowcase and taken away. But worst of all was that they transported my father to concentration camp Buchenwald in Germany. All sorts of terrible stories were related to my mother, and we did not know if we would ever see my father again. He was released after 3 weeks only because our papers were in order for our immigration to America. And to think that just a few years prior, he had been awarded the Iron Cross for his military service in the German army of World War I. We were forced to sell both our home and our business for a fraction of its worth. And soon thereafter, in January of 1939, we left for Holland, from where we were to sail to the United States. And for almost 9 months, while awaiting our quota number from the American State Department, my parents were assigned to take care of some 125 children. These young children had been sent by their parents from various parts of Europe to escape from the Nazis. In December of that year, 1939, we were deported to the detention camp of Westerbork in Holland to await our departure date to America. Camp Westerbork was constructed by the Dutch to accommodate Jews from various parts of Europe. In May of 1940, just 1 month before our planned departure date, the Germans invaded Holland and we were trapped. All of our belongings, which were about to be loaded on board ship, were burned and destroyed as the harbor of Rotterdam was bombed. Under Dutch control, Camp Westerbork was tolerable. My mother, father, brother, and I shared 2 small rooms. We all ate in the communal dining room, and at that time, there was enough food for us so that we did not go hungry. Adults were assigned to various work duties. My father worked to repair shoes. My mother worked in the kitchen. We children had a makeshift education and lived a very dull, stagnant life. Several months later, when the Nazi SS took over the command of Westerbork, we became acquainted with the ever-present, terrifying 12-foot high barbed wire. And as thousands of Jews were rounded up, many taken from their hiding places, as was Anne Frank and her family, Camp Westerbork became overcrowded. And it was at that time that we had to share our small quarters with another family. And then the dreadful transports to the concentration and extermination camps in Eastern Europe began. This started in early 1942. And from then on, every Monday night, lists of those to be deported were posted, causing incredible anxiety, anguish, and fear. And then on Tuesday mornings, men, women, and little ones were marched to a nearby railroad platform from where they were transported. This area became known as Boulevard de Misère. It was an area of complete misery. At 11 o'clock on Tuesday mornings, the trains left for their destination. And of the total 120,000 men, women, and children that departed Westerbork, 102,000 were doomed never to return. In January of 1944, it was our turn to be shipped out. We children were actually glad for a change of environment. We were very naive and we welcomed the move. We were allowed to take one knapsack each, and whatever we could stuff into it, we were permitted to take. When we approached the railroad platform and we saw the cattle cars in which we were to travel, our fears began to mount. Adults suspected, and they somehow knew what was in store for us. I remember that it was a bitter cold, pitch black, rainy night when we arrived at our destination, concentration camp Bergen-Belsen in Germany. We were pulled and dragged out of the cattle cars and greeted by the German guards who were shouting at us and threatening us with their weapons and with the most vicious attack dogs by their sides. I was a very frightened 9-year-old, and still to this day, I feel a certain sense of fear whenever I see a German Shepherd. Bergen-Belsen was divided into various areas. It was sectioned off and surrounded by electrified barbed wire. Guards were always in strategically placed high guard towers, and in the evenings, as soon as it would turn dark, the bright searchlights from above would constantly sweep the campgrounds. We were placed in a section that was known as the Sternlager, or the Star Camp, named so because we had to continue wearing that yellow star which had been issued to us back in Holland. Men were on one side of the camp and the women on the other, and this did make it possible at times for families to get a glimpse of one another. We were placed in this particular section of the camp with the hope of being exchanged for German nationals in Palestine, who the British put under house arrest because they were citizens of an enemy country. Unfortunately, that hope never materialized for our family. 600 of us, 600 of our people were crammed into each of the crude, wooden, heatless barracks, meant for 100 when originally built. There were triple-decker bunk beds with 2 people sharing each bunk. German winters were bitter cold and very long. We were given only one thin blanket per bunk and a straw-filled mattress. And this bunk was our only living quarters, and that for 2 people. I was very lucky that I was able to share a bunk with my mother and that my brother was able to share a bunk with our father. But can you imagine 2 adults, 2 strangers sharing a bunk under such horrendous conditions, a bunk that was no larger than the small cut bed that we're all so familiar with. I remember the first time seeing a wagon filled with what I thought was firewood for the one small oven that we had in our barrack. That oven, of course, was never used. I soon realized that what was in the wagon were dead, naked bodies thrown one on top of the other. Toilets and so-called washing facilities were at a great distance in the most primitive outhouses. Toilets were long wooden benches with holes cut into them, one next to the other. There was no privacy. There was no toilet paper. There was no soap, and hardly ever any water with which to wash. And in the almost year and a half that we were in Bergen-Belsen, never once were we able to brush our teeth. There were no trees, no flowers, nor did we ever see a blade of grass. And whenever it rained, We had to slosh through the mud, adding even more misery to our already dismal existence. Every morning, every single morning without fail, we were ordered to line up on a huge field. It was called an Appellplatz, 5 in a row as we were counted. We would have to stand there until each and every one of us was accounted for, often from early morning till late at night, without food, without water, no matter what the weather, without protective clothing. Frostbite was common. We would treat our affected toes and fingers with the warmth of our own urine. Our diet consisted of a slice of bread a day, some hot watery soup with grizzly meats and turnips and potato peel. Bread was later cut back and given to us just once a week, and only if our so-called quarters were neat and in order. Our birthday present to one another was that little piece of bread that we saved up from the previous week. Once a month, we were marched to an area to shower, and there, under the watchful eyes of the guards, we were ordered to undress. We had heard about exterminations and gas chambers in other areas of Europe, and we therefore were never sure when the faucets were turned on as to what would come out, water or gas. The Nazis did their utmost to break us physically, spiritually, and emotionally. Unfortunately, they did succeed with many of our people. It was not uncommon for people who were no longer responsible for their actions to attempt escape, even though they knew that the chance to succeed was next to impossible. But they also felt that they had nothing more to lose. The failure of their attempts were obvious when we saw their lifeless bodies hanging electrocuted against the barbed wire. Malnutrition, dysentery, and the loss of the will to go on is what destroyed body and mind. Death was an everyday occurrence. We as children saw things that no one, no matter what the age, should ever have to see. I know, of course, that you have all read, you have seen movies, I'm sure you've seen documentaries about the Holocaust, but the constant foul odor, the filth, continuous horror and fear surrounded by death is indescribable. There is no way that this can be put accurately into words or pictures. Our bodies, hair, and clothes were infested with lice. We learned that there is a distinct difference between head lice and clothes lice. Squashing them between my thumbnails became my primary pastime. Much of my time was taken up with make-believe games, and one game, a game based on superstition, became very, very important to me. I decided that if I were to find 4 pebbles of about the same size and shape, that would mean that the 4 members of my family would all survive. My mother, my father, my brother, and I. It was a torturous, painful, very difficult game to play. What if I couldn't find that 3rd or 4th pebble? Might that mean that 1 or 2 of my family members would not pull through? Nevertheless, this game gave me something to hold on to, some distant hope. After a number of months on our meager diets, our stomach shrunk so that the hunger was no longer painful. Teenagers and men suffered most from malnutrition and were the first to die. Those who lasted the longest were the women, and mothers in particular. It was their strong will to keep their children alive that kept them going. And my mother was one of those remarkable ladies. There is no doubt in my mind that it was my mother's inner strength and fortitude that finally saw us through. One day, my mother was able to smuggle some salt and some potatoes from the kitchen where she worked, and somehow managed to cook some soup in secret. This was done on our bunk. I was on the bunk with her, trying to hide and shield what she was doing. Soup was simmering, just about finished, when the German guards entered our barrack for surprise inspection. In our rush to hide that setup, the boiling soup spilled on my leg. We had been taught self-discipline and self-control the hard way, for I knew for sure, had I cried out, it would have cost us our lives. This happened in the spring of 1945. I was just 10 years old. The population in Kemperk and Belsen were dying off rapidly, but not nearly fast enough to satisfy the Nazis. Several weeks later, it was decided to send 3 trainloads of our people to Eastern Europe towards the extermination camps and the gas chambers. We did not know that Auschwitz, with its gas chambers, had already been liberated. My family was among the 2,500 on the last of these 3 trains. It was April of 1945. Russian army was closing in from the northeast, and the British and the Americans from the west. Under normal conditions, this train ride from Bergen-Belsen to whatever area of Eastern Europe they're going to send us would have taken no more than 10 hours. But because the Germans tried to evade the Allies, we were en route for 2 long weeks without food, without water, without medical supplies, without sanitary facilities. That meant no toilets. Whenever the train came to a stop, those who were able and those who were strong enough were permitted to get out and take a drink from a nearby stream or dig up roots to eat. My mother remembered taking some sort of a pot and collecting water from the locomotive, and who knows what else that pot was used for. The need for water at that time was almost more important than food because of the severe dehydration due to the dysentery and the high fever due to the typhus. Let me briefly explain typhus. It is a highly contagious, deadly disease that's caused from filth and spread by lice. At the same time, while the train was at a standstill, the newly dead were taken off and buried along the tracks. In addition, our train was subject to frequent air attacks by the Allies. It is truly remarkable how any one of us was able to survive under such horrendous conditions. In fact, 500 of our people, that's 1 out of every 5, died en route or shortly thereafter. My burned leg was severely infected, and it was impossible to keep the wound clean or lice-free. In late April, after 14 days of this surreal and horrifying journey, the German guards stormed frantically through the train, seeking civilian clothing so that they would not be recognized by the Allies. And we knew then that the war was coming to an end. It was the Russian army that liberated our train and led us to a nearby farm village in Eastern Germany. Most of the inhabitants had fled, and we took over their homes. Kitchens were stocked with ample food. It was rich and good, actually much too good for our starved bodies. We could not tolerate that unfamiliar nourishment. And at that time, at the age of 10 and a half, I weighed 16 kilos, or as we know it here in the United States, 35 pounds. And my mother weighed a mere 70 pounds. The Russians, in a crude way, tried to help us the best that they could. I was brought to a nearby clinic for medical attention. My leg was in very bad condition, and I was close to losing it. Fortunately, it was decided to treat the wound, and I was very lucky that my leg responded to medication and it gradually healed. As I regained my strength, I also relearned to walk. And in the interim, our heads were shaved because that was the only way that we could rid ourselves of head lice. Although we were all weak, ill, and thoroughly exhausted, I vividly remember the spring of 1945. The weather was beautiful, sunny and bright. Trees and grass were lush and green. Flowers were in bloom. Birds were singing. It was a wonderful, exciting feeling to be free at long last. We were all ill with typhus, but my father had to die from it 6 weeks after our liberation, and this after 6.5 years of mental torment and physical abuse. My 12-year-old brother, Albert, actually helped bury our father. When I talk about those years, it is as though I'm relating a nightmare, a very bad dream. I separate myself from it ever having happened to me, and that is how I deal with it. It is a wonderful story of how we gradually recuperated and were sent back to Holland to start our lives anew. My brother and I were eventually placed in the children's home in preparation to live in what was then British mandated Palestine, and we know today as Israel. Most of the children in this home survived alone without their parents. I felt like a total misfit. I needed to learn how to resettle into a normal society, had no training for that. Here I was by this time, 11 years old. I had never been in a store, had no idea what money was all about, had almost no table manners. It was like learning to live all over again. It was in this home that we became reacquainted with life in its normal state. Meals served us were delicious and nourishing. And you can imagine that just about anything and everything tasted good to us. And though our surrogate parents provided a very strict environment, much love and care were given us. I began my first formal education at that time at the age of 11 and a half. We were taught the secular subjects, reading, writing, arithmetic, in a Montessori school where we progressed at our own pace. The Dutch language in which we were taught was all new to us. We also received a thorough education in Hebrew and in religious studies. The British, who were governing Palestine in the 1940s, had issued what was known as the White Paper, restricting the number of Jews permitted into the land. They were interning many of the refugees ships and interning the survivors on the island of Cyprus. And in some cases, they actually turned the ships back to Europe. In November of 1947, the United Nations voted to partition Palestine between Arabs and Jews, which in May of 1948 led to the establishment of the State of Israel. And in 1947, just 1 year prior to Israel becoming a state, our illegal voyage from Holland to Palestine was planned, and danger once again loomed over us. And because parents at that time were not permitted to accompany their children, my mother managed to make arrangements for a family of 3 to emigrate to the United States. And thanks to the Holland America line, we were able to use the tickets which had been purchased 10 years earlier. We arrived in Hoboken, New Jersey, April 23rd, 1948, by coincidence, exactly 3 years to the day of our liberation. It was a Jewish relief organization, the Hebrew Immigration Aid Society, that found a home for us in Peoria, Illinois. I had never heard of the state of Illinois, certainly not of the city of Peoria. And there, at the age of 13, I once again started life anew in a strange land and again learning a new language. My third new language in less than 3 years. First Dutch, then Hebrew, and now English. And because of my inability to speak English, I, at the age of 13, was placed in the 4th grade with 9-year-olds. Although both my brother and I worked long hours after school to help our mom pay bills, I nevertheless found time. I actually made time to take extra courses during the year, attend summer school, and by working very hard in my studies, I was able to be graduated from Peoria Central High School 5 years later at age 18, ranking 8th in the class of 267 students. It was 2 months after high school graduation that I was married to Nathaniel Lazan, who I had met at the age of 16 in Peoria. And God willing, we'll be celebrating our 69th wedding anniversary this coming August. Nathaniel, come and say hello to these nice people all over the world.
Shalom, peace to all of you.
Hello. An amazing, amazing human being, my husband. He was an Air Force pilot and enormously disciplined and conscientious, for sure. I am grateful. I am very grateful that I survived healthy in body, mind, and spirit, and that together with my husband, I'm able to perpetuate my heritage with a wonderful family. We have 3 grown children, all 3 are happily married, and they've given us 9 beautiful grandchildren and 7 magnificent great-grandchildren. Amazing, amazing. I refer to this as survival and continuity. And in March of 1996, my memoir, Four Perfect Pebbles, co-authored by Lila Pearl, was published. And I'm so grateful that the story is in book form so that it can be passed on to future generations. Although I've spoken to upward of 1.5 million students and adults over these past 25 years or so, it still has not become easy. However, I do realize the importance of sharing that period of our history with you, and particularly with our young students in schools. As difficult as it is, I do realize the importance of sharing that story, because in a few short years, we will not be here any longer to give a first-hand account. Our young people are the last generation that will hear these stories firsthand. And I therefore ask them in particular to please share my story or any of the Holocaust stories that they read and hear about, to please share it with their friends, with their relatives, and someday to share it with their children. And yes, even with their grandchildren. When we are not here any longer, it is today's generation that will have to bear witness. As difficult as it is, the horror of the Holocaust must be taught, must be studied, and kept alive. Only then can we guard it from ever happening again. This, I don't know if you can see this. This is the very yellow star that I was forced to wear. It says Jude, which in German means Jew. It was just another way to denigrate us, to isolate us, and to set us apart from the rest of society. This, of course, represents the Star of David, a beautiful, meaningful Jewish symbol, but the Nazis made it so very ugly. Each of us, each and every one of us must do everything in our power to prevent such hatred, such destruction, and such terror from reoccurring. And we can begin by having love, respect, and tolerance and compassion towards one another, regardless of the religious belief, regardless of the color of our skin, regardless of the national origin. This respect towards one another must begin in our homes. We must pass it on in the communities, in the towns, in the cities, and only if there's respect and tolerance towards one another in the countries can we expect to have peace in the world. We must begin with our children. Let us treat people as individuals. Let us look for similarities and respect the differences. Let us build bridges and reach out towards one another. And we must be true to ourselves and not blindly follow a leader without thinking ahead and searching our hearts and our minds as to what the consequences might be. And when I speak in schools, I in particular tell them to please, please use their own minds before they just follow anyone's lead. We are all aware, and we should be, that 6 million Jewish people were murdered during the Holocaust. 6 million. I live in the state of New York, and New York State has a population of about 19 million. Can you possibly imagine almost 1 out of every 3 people in the state of New York wiped out? The 6 million also represent 1/3 of the entire pre-World War II Jewish population. And among them were 1.5 million children. We also need to remember that there were 5 million non-Jews who lost their lives. Among them were the righteous Gentiles, as we refer to them, very special people, non-Jews who jeopardized their lives to save Jewish families. They would hide them in the attics, they would hide them in the basements, farmers would hide them out in the barns, they were hidden in convents. And when these good people were caught doing what they felt was the right thing to do, they also were deported to concentration camps and in many cases lost their lives. And that brings me to another message. We must never generalize and judge an entire group by the actions of some within that group. These are all universal messages, messages that each and every one of us is familiar with to varying degrees, but need to be reminded of over and over again. And this certainly was a good opportunity to do so. These messages are the lessons learned from that dark period of our history, and certainly apply to today's world situation and definitely to our own individual lives. By listening, I hope that our young people prevent our past from becoming their future. I would like to briefly share something with you about my extraordinary mother. I don't know if you can see this, but this was my mom on her 104th birthday, 104. Mom passed away a number of years ago, 6 weeks short of 105, a remarkable, wise, beautiful lady. And she demanded of my brother, for one thing, there were 2 things that she demanded of my brother and me when we came to America. Number 1, learn English, learn it quickly. Number 2, work as hard as you can in school and at work in order to succeed. She was remarkable and was 40 years old when she came to America, did not know any English, learned to read, write, and speak a magnificent English. A very determined, strong-willed lady, for sure. And a fabulous mother-in-law to Nathaniel, and he was an extraordinary son-in-law to my mom. My brother dealt with this altogether differently than I. Albert passed away a few years ago, did not talk about it as freely as you heard it from me today, was happily married, lived in California, but by choice did not bring children into this world, had a very difficult time with organized religion. All of that made me very sad, but I did not fault Albert. We have to remember, he was 2 years older than I am, was with my father in the men's section, and I'm convinced that he saw and experienced things that I did not. God puts us on this earth, gives us a beautiful mind. It is this mind that allows us to choose right from wrong, good from evil. Therefore, men did this towards one another. But did he have to make it so bitterly cold when we were standing out there on the uphill all day? I have a direct line. I ask loads of questions. Don't get too many answers, but that's okay. Faith I will always have. After all, here I am. 3 children, 9 grandchildren, 7 great-grandchildren from whom generations will be forthcoming. He made sure that enough of us survived so that we will always be here. I am proud of my faith, as I'm certain you are proud of your faith and of your heritage. But please, please, let us all remember to respect the right of others to their belief. Be kind and good and respectful towards one another. That is the basis for peace. Had there been respect and tolerance towards one another and compassion towards one another some 75, 80 years ago, I would not be here with you today to share that dark period of our history. 9/11 would not have occurred. Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, North Korea, the Ukraine, Russia, all these countries that are in such turmoil would be peaceful countries for its people. Be kind and good and respectful towards one another, please. There is so little that we can do against the negativity in our world, but how we treat, behave, and reach out towards one another, that is entirely up to us. Any questions, I would be very glad to address them. And I certainly so much appreciate my dear friend, Cantor Manny Pullman, for having given me this opportunity. But I would like to answer any questions that you may have. And I know there may be some from Dr. Skarna.
Yes.
Yes.
First of all, there are no words to respond to Marion's triumphant message. I believe that faith teaches us that action is what is imperative. And my wife Janice and I, in a few weeks, will be visiting Bergen-Belsen. And when we are there for the first time at a concentration camp, celebrating my wife's 70th birthday, we will be with the souls and connect. And that, to me, will speak louder than any words I could say at this moment. So I will move on. During a recent outstanding course in psychology, our brilliant instructor, Dr. Anna Skarna, displayed a graph showing PTSD among Holocaust survivors. Her sensitive choice to illustrate this information made me realize and appreciate even more Marion's superhuman resilience and dogged determination to tirelessly devote her life to teach millions of children. We have two questions from Marion. The first will be asked by psychologist and neuroscientist, Dr. Anna Skarna, live from England.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Manny. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to this event. And I know that my colleagues and friends from the United Kingdom will join me in thanking you immensely for sharing your humbling experience and learning and the information that you've given us about the perseverance and determination, self-discipline, hope and faith that you displayed in this time. So my current work is on diversity and on human and non-human sentient beings and trauma and experiencing trauma and surviving from it. So my question may sound a little unusual, but my belief is that out of strong adversity comes strong creativity. And so I have really two questions that are related. The first is, what was the greatest positive psychological change that you experienced as a result of this highly challenging and hugely traumatic life circumstance? And related to this is really to your last point about telling our children, and they in turn telling their children and telling their children. What advice would you give to survivors, especially to second and third generations of offspring of not just Holocaust, but other trauma survivors? Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm not really certain what my attitude towards life would be had I not experienced such a traumatic childhood. That I certainly don't know. But I know for certain that my attitude towards life, my positive attitude towards life, is due to my mother. I was so fortunate that she was always by my side. And she instilled on me so many positive attributes, for sure. I mean, to be resilient, to be positive towards life in general. And this stubbornness, I'm a very stubborn person. And I think that's partially why I am here and determined, and that I'm going to make this happen. I'm going to overcome this, and things will get better. I will to get better. And that sort of ties in with our way of life today. We've got this COVID in our midst. Let us all be grateful for what we have and not kvetch and complain as to what we don't have. So I'm just so grateful that that I'm here today, and I'm so very grateful that I'm given the opportunity to spread positive attitudes towards life to so many. And what was the other question? What would I?
It was about the advice for second and third generations of trauma survivors.
My hope and my prayer is that these young people, they certainly are young, much younger than I am, that they will continue to pass the legacy of the Holocaust on to future generations. That's my hope, to tell their families' stories. No two stories pertaining to the Holocaust are alike, and we can learn from each and every one of them. I hope that they're strong enough and willing enough to pass the legacy on. That's my hope. Okay.
Thank you. Many of you have tuned into our Destination Peace podcast will recognize Nyla Chowdhury. She was an eyewitness to the rampant injustice and horrible crime against girls and women as a teenager growing up in Bangladesh. She risked her life to change the culture in her birth country. My adopted sister Nyla will ask Marion the last question.
Thank you, Manny. I am so moved, in a way, kind of speechless. Marion, your words and your journey, it's a humbling experience. Manny has allowed us to come into the same platform to hear from you directly. It's a privilege to hear from you directly. I have worked 25 years in this line back in Bangladesh and in 10 countries, serving humanity in the worst of states. But what I heard from you is one, like what I've experienced is a drop in the ocean. I have dealt with acid survivors, which is the worst in our country, sexual abuse, human trafficking, and domestic violence. I am myself a survivor, and I would be humbled to know that in hundreds of your visits with school children, what has been one of the most moving and unanticipated question asked of you by the children? I would love to know from you.
Yeah, there were various questions that were asked from a child's perspective, but the one that I found very somewhat unusual was and these were young children, they were 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds maybe. Do I ever regret having born Jewish? Okay. And of course, I was taken aback that a child should ask that. That meant that they really did understand the inner story, the story itself. And so my answer, of course, is never regretted having been born Jewish. I did have my issues with our man upstairs, for sure. Wondering where was he when we were suffering so severely, and there was such evil surrounding us. But as I got older, I realized that men did this towards one another, as I'd mentioned earlier. And he must have been crying also when he saw that what his children were doing towards one another. And regret, I'm very proud, as you heard me say, I'm proud of my religious belief, and we all should be. But the important thing is that we respect other people's beliefs and heritage, for sure. That's for sure. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Your lessons and what we heard through your experience, I take it deeply into my soul to teach, because my present work is sort of to see a world without violence, to work towards peace in the world with many. And this is something we take forward to give dignity and resilience to people who are not privileged to see it. But once I see the light from you, I take it and will carry it forward, hopefully, to spread compassion, love, and peace in the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, let us hope that the destination for everyone, everywhere, will be peace. And I wish you our listening and audio and visual audience, each and every one of you, your children, your grandchildren, and all succeeding generations, a healthy, happy, productive future in a world of love and peace. Thank you.
Marion stayed alive through discovering 4 perfect pebbles. It is humanity's challenge to walk 4 perfect paths. The first path is to live, nurture, teach, and love our families. The second path is to find ways to live in peace and harmony with our neighbors. The third path is for parents to regularly teach children tolerance in their homes, so that walking the fourth path, we will be able to share mutual respect. Our priority must be to find more effective ways to interact peacefully by respecting our diverse differences, and make it an imperative to desperately and tirelessly seek out until we have discovered our mutually shared similarities. Thank you, Marion, and thank you, Nathaniel. Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Nyla and Huma. And to all of you, you're my friends, and I thank you for transcending time by consecrating it with us by your presence virtually today. God bless you all, and thank you for being with us. Thank you, Marion. God bless you.
Thank you, Manny, for introducing me to your dear friends. Thank you. Thank you all. And Huma, thank you for sharing your tech expertise with all of us. Okay. Thank you.
Take care, everyone. God bless.